Welcome, everybody. Good Shabbat. Today, we're going to talk about the so called end of the world. A lot of Christian evangelicals and Protestant churches do heavily preach the idea of the end of the world, where Jesus will purportedly descend from the clouds from heaven as the Davidic Messiah and conquer all the evildoers in this judgment day type of thing, where fire shall be laid upon the earth. None of it is very positive imagery, and also, thankfully, none of it is very historical. It does not agree with the probable historical teachings of Jesus. So in this brief class, I'm going to teach the end of the world debunked. So let's discuss that together. Paul and other early Christians forced Jesus to be the Davidic Messiah, despite Jesus's disbelief in a Davidic Messiah. So isn't this interesting, right? The earliest Christian documents we have come from the seven agreed upon authentic letters of Paul, according to biblical scholarship. For many reasons, we've come to the conclusion that some of Paul's letters were really written by Paul, and others were written at a later time, which we can discuss in other classes in the future. But needless to say, Paul's authentic letters do declare that Jesus is the Messiah ben David, which is a royal Messiah or anointed one from God that stems down from the lineage of King David of Old Testament fame, Hebrew Testament fame. So we'll discuss this a little bit further, but I first just wanted to substantiate from canonical gospels that all Orthodox Christians agree with that Jesus clearly does not believe in a Messiah ben David, despite the fact that throughout the Gospels, everybody's calling him Jesus, son of David, or blah, 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 something similar, because they're trying to attach this son of David onto Jesus so that Jesus becomes eligible to become the Messiah ben David. And there's all sorts of problems. There's one lineage that stems down from Mary and one lineage that stems down from Joseph, trying to make Jesus linked back to David and so on and so forth so he could become this Davidic Messiah. In Jewish culture, lineage was not traced to the mother. So we know historically that the lineage that we find in the New Testament that starts with Mary and works back all the way back to Adam, etc., that's false. Anybody that understands Judaic idea understands that lineage is traced to the father and not to the mother. And the other problem that we come to is that whenever there's another lineage, I believe it's in the Gospel of Matthew, that the lineage is traced, Jesus as the son of Joseph, they trace the lineage back through Joseph's line to King David, etc. And I believe it's Luke that uses Mary as the basis of the lineage, trying to link Mary all the way back to King David. So again, Mary's out of the picture. Sorry, I love her. She's one of my favorite people of all history, but Judaic culture did not trace lineage to the mother. It was a patriarchal society at that point in time. So next we're left to look at Joseph. If we're looking at Joseph, if Joseph descended from the line of King David, how does that affect Jesus? Unless we're admitting that Joseph was Jesus's biological father, which historically he probably was. Just saying. And I'm sorry if that offends people, but it's just true. Jesus was probably the son of Joseph. However, the way that Orthodox Christians want to frame the teachings of the New Testament, they want us to believe that the Holy Spirit inseminated Mary and that God was the father of Jesus. Let's take that scenario as true. If God was the father of Jesus and Joseph was just a stepfather, how does that make Jesus linked to the lineage of David to make him the Davidic Messiah? The answer is it does not. My opinion and the opinion of some biblical scholars is that the lineage of Joseph is probably the correct one, or closer to the correct lineage of Jesus's history, and that Joseph was the biological father of Jesus, most likely. The idea of son of God was also heavily misconstrued, because in Jewish culture, if we understand the Jewish culture that Jesus came from, Son of God is an indication of a saint. It's not that you were actually born as a result of God and a female on earth mixing to produce you. Son of God simply meant that you were very spiritually evolved and you were worthy of being called a son or daughter of God. Such a person was a Sadiq, or a perfected one. So, needless to say, I do believe personally that Jesus was born. His biological father was Jesus. His biological mother was Mary. They produced him by normal, natural means, but he was an elevated spiritual soul. I do believe that Joseph was from the line of the king of David, and that Jesus had David's blood within him. So I do believe it's okay to call him son of David, but I do not believe Jesus was the Davidic Messiah. And we have evidence to the fact that Jesus himself did not believe he was the Davidic Messiah when we look at Mark, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 35 through 37. While Jesus was teaching in the temple, he said, "How can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, by the Holy Spirit, declared, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.' David himself calls him Lord. So how can he be his son?" And the large crowd was listening to him with delight. So here Jesus point blank says that the Messiah is not the son of David. It's not the Davidic Messiah. Jesus himself does not subscribe or self-identify as the Davidic Messiah that Paul and the canonical Gospels try to make him out to be. It's right there. You just have to read it. It's in the canonical Gospels. It's not even in some other scroll or some Gnostic gospel that we can dispute and say, well, we say that's not true. All Christians agree or see Mark as a source of wisdom from Jesus. And right here, Jesus says, how can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself calls him Lord. So how can he be his son? In other words, there's no such thing. According to Jesus, just to be fair, if we're taking this as a probable historical teaching of Jesus, Jesus is saying that he himself does not subscribe to the Davidic Messiah. And just so you know, not all Jews do ascribe to a Davidic Messiah. There are many different messianic expectations in Judaism. And the Messiah ben David was just one of several expectations that I'm aware of. And there's probably more of them that I'm not aware of. But Jesus here is saying that he doesn't believe that the Messiah is the son of David. He doesn't believe in a Davidic Messiah. He doesn't believe in a royal conqueror anointed by God from the Davidic lineage coming down to earth, conquering all the foes of Judaism and establishing New Jerusalem on earth with him as the ruler. Jesus says, nope, I don't buy it. But yet, Paul and all the writers of the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, they all push this idea that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah and that he's going to come again in judgment. And this is preached throughout Catholicism, Orthodox Christianity, Protestantism, evangelical churches, etc. They all preach him as such. But Jesus himself, right here on your nose, says, I'm not the Davidic Messiah. Point blank. So we have to take Jesus at his word. He's not the Davidic Messiah. So why is everybody calling him the Son of God? Well, a lot of people, a lot of scribes handled these Gospels and things were added over time. And we're aware of this in biblical scholarship. We're aware that different ideas came along and were inserted. We're aware of the power that the Roman Catholic Church once had over the world and that they really wanted their doctrine to be the only way. Yes, the Catholic Church has become more liberal, and good for Pope Francis for being such a great leader of his church. I really like him. But still, underneath all of that, the Catholics will say they're the only way. So that only way became inserted in over the course of time, and it became the way it was. And it's very interesting that this statement from Jesus in Mark 12, verses 35, 37 still exists. They never took it out. And when something like this is so blunt in your face, contrary to the teachings found throughout the Gospels, biblical scholarship tends to say that when something like this happens, it's probably historical. And it's amazing. It's only God's grace that this verse still exists today. And that's probably because it's a little bit of a confusing read. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. The Lord is God, said to my Lord, which is the Messiah, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. David himself calls him Lord, so how can he be his son? Because the father would never be subordinate to a son. The son was subordinate to the father, especially in David's case, since he was the king. His son would definitely be subordinate to him. So that's Jesus's reasoning, is that, he would never call his son Lord. Anyhow, moving on, we've covered that sufficiently. Where did the idea of Jesus as Davidic Messiah come from? We already gave a little bit of a cheat earlier and told you that that came from Paul. The idea of the Messiah as a conquering king came from Paul's teachings that he developed. Paul was a Pharisaic Jew, and he understood very well about the idea of the resurrection of the dead and the day of the Lord, in which there would be some sort of judgment from God. The day of the Lord was originally Yahweh, God, judging the earth, and there will be a resurrection, a physical resurrection of the dead. And many of the Jews, and apparently Paul of that time, did believe that a Davidic Messiah would come. And the Davidic Messiah was a Judean expectation. Not all areas of the Jewish diaspora believed in the same kind of Messiah. You'll have to do a little bit of research. We can talk about it in the future. But the Judeans were highly oppressed by the Romans at this time, after Jesus' death, right before Jesus' death. And they were looking for somebody to save them. They were looking for a royal, anointed Messiah, a being that was blessed by God to come and conquer the earth, to come and reestablish Israel as the power on earth. This Davidic Messiah, which Paul conflated to be Jesus, would descend from the clouds and destroy the Roman occupation and any other kind of occupation. And Israel would be the world. It would be New Jerusalem. The world would be New Jerusalem, and this Davidic Messiah would sit on his throne and rule on behalf of God in the heavens. For Jews that had this messianic expectation of a son of David coming to earth, they could never accept Jesus as the Davidic Messiah. It was the major reason why there was this rift between early Jewish Christians and Gentile Christianity and the Jewish faith. Because Jews, the Davidic Messiah could not be defeated. He could not be killed. He was victorious. He was the descendant. He was to crush all opposition with ease. Jesus died on a cross. And furthermore, in Deuteronomy, it says that anyone who's hung on a tree is accursed of God. And Jesus was hung on a tree. So we have these problems arising here in the text. So this was the problem that we're facing theologically, is that Paul really needed a reason for Jesus to be successful. And the only way he could make Jesus successful is kind of conflating him with the Isaiah suffering servant and saying that he died for truth and that he would ultimately come back by descending from heaven and conquering the earth as the Davidic Messiah. So Paul essentially made Jesus all things to all people in the expectations of Messiah for the Jewish people. And some Jewish people did convert to Judaism, but most of them did not. They could not accept Jesus in this light. It did not make sense to them. So that was a problem. So here in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, we find Paul declaring Jesus the Davidic Messiah. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets to the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh. So here and many other places in Paul's letters, we see Paul insinuating and declaring that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah, despite the fact in Mark that Jesus himself said that he didn't even believe in a Davidic Messiah. But this is the root of Christianity calling Jesus the Davidic Messiah, who would come at Judgment Day, cause a cataclysmic end to the world as we knew it, and create a new Jerusalem with those that, were good boys and girls. The bad boys and girls would go somewhere else, quite warmer than New Jerusalem, according to the dogma created by the church and put into Jesus's mouth. So Paul taught that his distorted Jesus Messiah ben David would herald the end of the world, the so-called second coming of Christ that would he would descend from the clouds. He would judge the living and the dead after this resurrection event. Everybody would rise from their graves in these new bodies, and bam, those that were good would go to New Jerusalem, heaven on earth, and those that were bad would go to hell. And this is the source of that developed Christian dogma that we see today, which is all ahistorical and not a teaching of the true Jesus, the Master Jesus, Mar Yeshua. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, 9 through 10, we see, for the people of those regions report about us what kind of welcome we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve a living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus who rescues us from the wrath that is coming. So God's wrath is to descend on the earth in this, at the end days, the end of time, so to speak. And what would herald this end of the world as we know it, this cataclysmic halt of history, was that Jesus would descend from heaven as the Davidic Messiah, the dead would physically raise, and then Jesus would judge the living and the dead. And there would be a separation that would occur. Jesus, as divine judge, would make the good people come with him to this heavenly New Jerusalem, and everybody else would go to hell, essentially. So by having faith in Jesus, Paul believed and taught that the death and resurrection of Jesus conquered sin. And sin was not just individual sin, but there's a cosmic sin that Paul taught about, a darkness that made us sin, that influenced us to sin, and that Jesus, by believing in Jesus's death and resurrection, you are forgiven from all sin. And when Jesus would descend from the clouds as the Davidic Messiah, that made you eligible to be in the good boys and girls group. And you would avoid the wrath of God. You would not be sent to the fiery pits of hell for all eternity. And again, none of this is the historical teaching of Jesus. It's Paul's imagination, his mystical revelations that had no basis in the actual teachings of Jesus. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 2 through 3. For you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. When they say there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. So the day of the Lord, this cataclysmic end of the world that would be initiated by the rising of the dead and this resurrection of the physical resurrection of everybody that died, they would all come back to life so they could be judged with the living, those that are still alive on earth. And here Paul's saying, you better get your act together, because the day of the Lord, this cataclysmic end of the earth, it's going to come any moment. It's going to surprise you like a thief entering your house at night. And then that sudden destruction is going to happen. So you better get ready for it. You better be good boys and girls. You better do as I say. So this helped the Roman Catholic Church and most Orthodox Christians keep their congregations in line and under their thumb. A lot of power comes to those that are in charge of churches that teach this way, doesn't it? It's either my way or the highway. The basis of Paul's eschatological thought process. This comes from the Bible, a historical and literary introduction by Bart D. Ehrman. Here's a picture of the book to the left. I highly recommend it to anybody that wants to truly understand what's in the Bible. It's a good starting point. And it's an entertaining read. It's not dry or boring at all. You'll find yourself laughing out loud, and you'll find it very illuminating. It was one of the best books I've ever read in my Christian studies. Anyhow, here's an excerpt from Bart's book. Because Paul was a Pharisee before he became a Christian, he already would have held to an apocalyptic view of the world. Specifically, Pharisees, like other apocalypticists, maintained that at the end of this evil age, when the day of judgment arrived, there would be a resurrection of the dead. Those who had sided with God would be rewarded. Those who had opposed him would be punished. Now you need to ask yourself, if someone believes that the resurrection of the dead is to happen at the very end of this age, when history as we know it was to come to a crashing halt, what would that person think if they came to believe that someone had been resurrected? Their immediate thought would almost certainly be, it has started. That is, the resurrection of the dead has begun. This was Paul's conclusion. Before believing in Jesus, he thought that the resurrection was soon to come. When he came to believe that Jesus was raised, he concluded that the end was already here. He then was living at the end of time in the last days. And so far as we can tell, this was a view that Paul held until the end of his life. So a lot of people even today are predicting the end of the world in 2633, some ridiculousness like that. And many of us have been around long enough to see cults declare the end of the world happening this year at this month, and then all their followers commit suicide or do some ridiculous stunt that is induced by a cult leader. And this craziness is all based in this idea that the end is coming. The end of the world is coming. And Paul himself taught that the end of the world was coming. That's why he said, if you're not married, don't get married. Just focus on Jesus. Focus on this dogma that I'm teaching you, because you need to get yourself right with God, because the end's going to come like a thief in the night. It's coming any day now. So Paul taught that the end of the world was coming right now, and right now was over 2,000 years ago. And guess what? We're all still here. So guess what? Paul is wrong. If Paul was wrong about that, what else is Paul wrong about? Right? Right. So let's get to the real understanding, the actual probable historical teachings of Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus. What did he mean when he said the end is still to come? This comes from Mark, and this particular teaching is in all of the canonical Gospels, with slight variations and slight additions as history moved on. So historically, the first things that came were the letters of Paul. So Paul teaching this dogma of the second coming of Jesus. And before that, the teachings of Jesus were all oral. And we do have different documents which describe probable historical teachings of Jesus that aren't accepted by the Orthodox Christians, because it does not support these things that we're debunking today. So we have to learn to discern what is probably true and what is probably not true. Again, in Mark earlier, we saw Jesus say, I do not believe in the Davidic Messiah. Who is our teacher? Jesus or Paul? Are you going to accept what Jesus said, or are you going to accept what Paul said? Well, then go to Paulinity. Paul, I don't even know how to say it. Paulinity? Have a religion of Paul, because that's what Christianity is. The actual real teachings of Jesus, 95% of the time, what we're given in Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, just is not historical. It's not historical to Jesus. Let's examine what is a probable historical teaching about the so-called end times. We find this in Mark. Again, there's a progression over time, and more details are added. Mark was the first of the canonical Gospels, followed by Matthew, followed by Luke, and John was much later, like 120 AD, way after the crucifixion of Jesus. And it's the most full gospel in the sense because that's when Christians had pretty much crystallized their viewpoints and had created and decided mostly upon their doctrine and their dogma of how they wanted to control people. The real teachings of Jesus free people, just so you know. Yeshua, Jesus' Hebrew name, means liberation. He came to liberate us, not imprison us. And when you look at the history of the Roman Catholic Church, it came to imprison us. And although other factions of Christianity that are Orthodox based broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, they still kept a lot of those ideas so that they can control their congregations. But always know, if you have a real spiritual teacher, if it's a real spiritual master, they do not want control over you. They want the best for you, which is union with God. And they're going to show you that path clearly. And that path is mostly very solitary. But anyhow, before I get way off topic, Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. As he came out of the temple, that is the second temple, the Jewish second temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" So here we're talking about the end, the destruction of the second temple. Jesus here is in the role of prophet. He is prophesying that soon the second temple, one of the greatest wonders of the world, will be destroyed by the Romans. That's what we're talking about here, so it's clear. Let's continue. Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come." So here we have to understand Jesus is not talking about the end of the world, a cataclysmic end of the world. He's talking about the end of the city of Jerusalem, the end of the second temple. So he's telling his close inner circle of disciples, when you hear about wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed, because I'm telling you ahead of time so you can be prepared. Prepared is forewarned, right? So this must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. The birth pangs of what? The birth pangs of Messiah. This alone, right here, this statement, Jesus is saying that the advent of Messiah is signaled whenever nation rises against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there'll be earthquakes, natural disasters, famines, And that begins the birth pangs of the advent of Messiah. Pause for a moment. Didn't Paul in the canonical Gospels say that the Messiah was already here in the form of Jesus? Right here, Mark chapter 13, verse 8. Jesus is saying this is the beginning of the birth pangs of Messiah. This catastrophic, cruel, tragic event is what inspires the beginning of the Bar Enosh, Son of Mankind collective Messiah, which is the communion of Christian saints, those that follow Jesus's teachings and become part of this communion of saints, which are saints from all traditions, stemming back to the primordial traditions that we don't even fully know of, except in the collective unconsciousness of all humanity. But Jesus believed that this devastation and those that will come, difficulties, create saints. Nobody becomes spiritually perfected without challenges. And imagine the challenges being described here, right? You really have to be deeply spiritual, faith and trust in God to get through this. You have to cling to your spiritual practices. You have to cling to your faith, cling to the Torah, cling to everything that you hold dear in order to make it through this. And there's a massive purification happening to humanity at this point in time. And it makes people decide, is this evil, this destruction what I want? Or do I want to create a better world for myself and humanity? And when people decide that they want to create a better world for themselves and humanity, that is when they truly become eligible to become part of the Bar Enosh, Son of Mankind, collective Messiah, or the communion of saints. So the birth pangs of Messiah is the second Adam. And the true second Adam is a spiritualized humanity. The old Adam or first Adam is a humanity that is immersed in selfishness and fear. Just read the Hebrew Testament. Jesus's teachings, as he felt them to be, were for the purification and sanctification of each soul, so that that soul may have a messianic marriage with this communion of saints. Your soul can become merged in this immense body of enlightened masters, spiritually perfected beings, sons and daughters of God. So Jesus predicted that this communion of saints, this purified second humanity, which is known as the Bar Enosh, Son of Mankind, collective Messiah, when the Jewish temple fell, that would begin the birth pangs of people going through the pain of societal change and personal change that would purify them and make them eligible to become a saint. So the Messiah, Jesus adhered to the Son of Man Messiah, which was a collective Messiah. It was a Babylonian expectation of Messiah. And in this Babylonian expectation of the Son of Man Messiah, which stems back in the book of the book of Daniel and the books of Enoch, this is a collective Messiah. And that's what Jesus taught. So for Jesus, the birth pangs of Messiah, in which more and more people would begin to purify themselves and make them eligible to be married into the communion of saints. For Jesus, it started with the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple. We conclude here, Mark chapter 13, verses 14 through 23. But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop must not go down or enter the house to take anything away. The one in the field must not turn back to get the coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not be in winter, For in those days there will be suffering, such as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now. No, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he has cut short those days. Let's pause there and examine what we've talked about. Jesus is saying, once you hear about wars and rumors of wars, when you see these earthquakes and these famines, these are signs that I'm prophetically telling you about. I'm warning you about it. When these signs happen, you must get out of Jerusalem immediately. Don't take anything with you. Go to the mountains and get out of Dodge. And if some of those apostles and early Christians that followed Jesus didn't get out of there, we wouldn't know about Christianity. We wouldn't know about Jesus. Jesus warned them well ahead of time to look for these particular signs. And when they saw them, which heralded the end, the destruction of Jerusalem and the second temple, not the whole world, then you have to get out of Jerusalem. Because if you die, my teachings will die with you. And Jesus foresaw the horrors, and he just said, please don't let anybody be pregnant at that time, because pregnant women are particularly vulnerable. They have to protect their children. And also their babies will starve, because if there's famines, how can the mother produce breast milk, right? And he says in verse 18, pray that it not be in winter, because winter is cold, where diseases tend to spread even more. So, and many more people even today die in winter than they do in the other warmer seasons, because the cold and the dampness worsens disease and sicknesses, colds, flus. And that's why so many people die every year during flu season. So Mar Yeshua even says about this time that there's never been such suffering since the beginning of the creation, nor will there ever be at any time in all the future of the planet Earth. So this was just a horrific time. And he said that if the Lord himself, if God had not cut short those days, then nobody would have been saved. Meaning none of the Jews in Jerusalem would have survived. So this isn't talking about being saved at the end of the world. It's talking about the fact that if the Lord hadn't shown his grace to some of the people of Jerusalem by helping them to survive and get out of there ahead of time, or somehow survive during the onslaught of the attack of the Romans, then nobody would have been saved. All of Jerusalem, people within it would have died. Finally, verses 21 through 23. And if anyone says to you at that time, look, here's the Messiah, or look, there he is, do not believe it. Jesus right here is saying, don't believe in a Davidic Messiah. Don't believe that this is the end of the world. If people say, look, there he is, do not believe it. He's again debunking the idea of a solo Davidic Messiah. Because here there are many people of the Jews that were expecting the end of the world. And if you were living in Jerusalem at this time, you would think it was the end of the world. And you would be expecting the Davidic Messiah to have come. This was in about 70 AD. So Jesus is saying, look, this is not the end of the world. It might be the end of our world as we know it, but we can survive. When you see these signs, get out and take as many people as you can with you, so that our culture, so that our teachings can survive. But if somebody says, look, here's the Messiah, or look, there he is, believing it's the end of the world, do not believe it. It's right here, under our eyes. Mar Yeshua concludes, false messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce signs and omens to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be alert. I have already told you everything. So in conclusion, Jesus did not preach an eschatological end of the world in these popular teachings that we see evolve through the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. This is a historical story of Jesus warning his apostles and his disciples to get out of Jerusalem before the Romans destroy Jerusalem, the second temple, and everybody in Jerusalem that they can kill. When you see these signs, I'm telling you, it's about to happen. Get out and flee to the mountains. And these early Jewish Christians are believed to have merged with the Ebionites and the Essenes. And then ultimately, much later in time, we have Paul talking about his Gentile church that had one belief, that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah. And then you have the Jewish Christians that viewed Jesus as the Son of God. Not the Son of God as in God mating with Mary, creating this magic child, but a Son of God in the Jewish understanding of it. That Jesus was a perfected saint, a spiritual master, a sage that truly understood God's will for those on earth. And then if we follow these teachings, we can then purify ourselves and become eligible to become one with the communion of saints, the Baranosh collective Messiah, the new humanity. Humanity, souls that reintegrate themselves with this humanity of whiteness, of light, of purity. It's been described many ways in many traditions. And let us conclude there. But I hope that this has helped you. For those that have anxiety about the end of the world because they've been taught this by their spiritual teachers, know that Jesus did not teach that. He taught what is presented here today. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother of the universe, help us to always understand the truth in all matters, to be discerning, to not accept what everybody teaches us, but to really look at what's actually right under our noses. May we all follow the historical teachings of Mar Yeshua. May each of our souls be married or have union with the communion of saints, the Baranosh, the Son of Mankind collective or corporate Messiah. May we all be anointed by God. May we all be children of God. May we all be loving servants of the divine. Amen, amen, amen. Good Shabbat, everybody. I'll see you next Friday. Thank you.